Victor's not feeling well, so we're going to have Eric run his slides.
Okay. Yeah, I uploaded the deck about an hour ago, so hopefully there no changes have been made since then.
Cool. Yeah, I don't think there have. Thank you. Good. Yeah, I think everything's been working good. I tested the mics. I think we're good. Sweet. Thank you. Yeah. Oh. So can I text or do I have to call? You can text. Oh, perfect. Okay, thanks. That's awesome. Awesome. Thanks. Yeah, I was in this room in the previous session. Everything seemed to work perfectly. So apart from the construction next door, not much we can do about that. Awesome. Thank you. Favorite. All right. Well, I'm not a cool chair like Alan, who is literally eating chocolate as we speak. I could be. All right, next time. Alan, you have some more for Dustin? All right. Well, thank you, Dustin, for offering to take minutes. All right, Bernard, I think we can get started. What do you think?
Yep.
All right. For folks in the back, if you want to take a seat, we're getting started. Hello and welcome everyone to the WebTransport session at IETF 120. Next slide, please. So if you're not familiar with MeetEcho, these are the buttons and all the things. As usual, especially reminder if you're remote to please use headphones or to make sure you mute when you're not talking. The echo cancellation doesn't work super well. Next slide, please. Since this is now a hybrid meeting, we request that if you want to say something, you join the queue by raising your hand in the tool. As a reminder, please all sign in to fill in the blue sheets. That way, remote folks can join the queue just like the folks who are here. And we encourage you to turn your video on when your audio is on, but to keep it muted when you're not talking. Next slide. Here are some links if you're looking at the PDF later. Next slide. All right, this is the IETF note well. If you are in this room, whether physically or virtually, you have agreed to this by registering for the event. As a reminder, it mentions many things that you have to follow, in particular our code of conduct and our IPR policy. If you're not familiar with these, go look up the note well and please read it. Next slide. And as an extended reminder, we really strive to have professional and happy conversations here and everywhere at IETF, and the chairs will be enforcing that. If you see or hear anything that wasn't great, feel free to reach out to us, the chairs, or to the Ombuds team if you prefer. We will make sure to have it handled. Thank you very much. All right, next slide. All right, some more links. Oh, right. My name is David Skenazy, and my co-chair is Bernardo Boba, who is remote. I will be looking at the chat. If you want something said at the microphone and you can't get to the microphone yourself, feel free to type Mike : and your text, and I will repeat it. And thank you to Dustin for taking notes. Next slide, please. All right, so we're going to start with our traditional W3C update, and then have Eric talk about WebTransport over HTTP2. Victor's unfortunately not feeling well, so Eric is also going to be the one talking about WebTransport over HTTP3, and that's our plan for today. Does anyone want to bash this agenda? All right, next slide, please. Janivar, you're up.
Brewery from Mozilla. I'm here to give an update on the W3C Web Transport Working Group, which I co-chair with Will Law from Akamai. So this is an update from our previous time. We updated you back in March. We published a working draft on June 4th, and our charter is expiring soon, but it was extended to end of August, and we are renewing and extending by 2 years beyond that, and that is out for AC to review yesterday. So we have a timetable that we keep pushing out a little bit. So this is what we're looking at right now. We're still finishing up some issues. We want to get to candidate recommendation, which we're very close to. And we have like only a couple of open issues, some of which we'll mention here today. And a reminder that we also have the annual KeyPack meeting, which will be held on the 23rd to the 27th of September in Anaheim, where we have a 2 p.m. to 4 p.m. slot on Tuesday, December 24th. Next slide. So an update on major decisions and updates since our last report. We added a note about retransmissions and send order. And that note is that ordering of retransmissions is implementation defined, but user agents are strongly encouraged to prioritize retransmissions of data with higher send order values. And the other small API change is we now support relative URLs, which was a recent change to WebSockets. So we're just following suit there. And also on priorities, a lot of it is in implementation defined, but we're trying to refine it a little bit. And this is language that says sending datagrams should be given priority over sending streams, but not to the point of blocking the stream flow completely. And the definition here of not starving them is left up to the implementation. It's a tricky area to be specific in this area, and we're still looking to see if this is sufficient. Next slide. And there's no
Sorry, this is Alan.
major updates
about the priorities, if that's okay, or do you want to take it at the end?
Sorry,
I had a question about the datagram priority thing, but if you want to take it at the end, that's fine.
No, let's do it now.
So Alan Frindell, I'm the chair of the MOQ working group, and the MOQ working group had a multi-day interim last month and did a lot of thinking and has come up with the priority design, which is in the current draft 05, which published a couple weeks ago. And it's not totally compatible with the always give datagrams priority. So that may be an area where we might want to get together, or you may want to take a look at what we've come up with there as input.
Very good. Yes. Is there a brief summary, or
no?
Okay.
That is not entirely true. I think if you rewatch yesterday's MOQ session, or if you look at Ian Sweat's slide, which slide deck, which gives an update on what happened between draft 3, 4, and 5, there is a slide that summarizes how we want to prioritize things, but it is in terms of MOQ object model things, which and any of those things can be a datagram. So essentially, like how something is transported is totally independent of how it's prioritized. So it's, that's the way in which it's not compatible.
If you wouldn't mind, if you could open an issue on a W3C issue tracker, that would be fantastic.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks. All right, next slide. No major updates on implementation browser support. It's coming along. We have 2 implementations and a third one coming along. Next slide. And so we have some, we're doing really good cleaning up our candidate recommendation issues. We have some issues and PRs with IETF dependencies. And the 3 things we're trying to do is we're trying to add support for client-initiated drain, which is blocked on issue IETF issue 167. Do we need drain WebTransport session? That needs debate and resolution. Basically, we're asking. We started adding API. We started thinking about adding APIs for client-initiated drain, but the question was raised whether we actually need it. And the second one was we were trying to add a protocols or sub-protocols constructor argument to WebTransport, similar to WebSockets. And the issue there is right now we have a PR, but it's linking to HTTP 3. And then there's an issue open to move this to the overview doc, and also have a similar issue entry added to HTTP 2, because we want protocols should probably work for both HTTP 2 and HTTP 3. This has been assigned to Eric Kinnear and has a PR, it says. And also there's a dependency on data received. There's a PR that data received says all data committed. There's an existing PR 14 that needs to be merged. So those are the dependencies. Next slide. And also we have a PR that is adding some stats potentially. This is for helping with congestion control. So we already have a stat called estimated send rate. And so there's some questions whether we should add additional information that a congestion control algorithm in JavaScript could benefit from, or a sending algorithm could benefit from. These are quote booleans. There's 3 of them. There's the boolean to say, is sending data limited? This is basically, is sending application limited? Which would tell you, which would start out true. And then if there's a network congestion, then the value would flip to false. The second one is sending server limited, which is basically the server is overloaded with data and is providing back pressure, basically, for instance, through flow control. And the last one is sending slow start, which is basically a Boolean that starts out true if the client congestion controller implements slow start. The question is, congestion control is quite a tricky area to get right, especially in JavaScript. So we're not sure. This is fairly new ground, and we figured we'd have a lot of good experts in this room that might be asking. So it'd be useful to ask this group: do we think this would be useful? Is this a useful starting point? Is there anything missing? For instance, it was also pointed out that maybe instead of Booleans, something like a frame counter for blocked frames that we've seen sending from the client to the server, I think, would that be useful? Do we discuss this here?
Yeah, it looks like you have 3 folks interested with questions or comments. Let's find
Oh,
out.
great.
Magnus.
Yes. I wonder how you would derive the sending data limited. I mean, that's depending on what timescales you're looking at, or we're saying it's if you would poll this frequently enough, you would, even if you were sending data, you would be partially false and partially true, depending on saying, okay, when have you transmitted data, etc. How long is until you actually have new CWIN, etc. It becomes interesting. I don't know how it will actually help, but the others have view of this. I didn't quite catch how are you determining that the sending server is limited? Are you based on flow control, or what are you basing that?
By the way, just right before you answer, Magnus, you're coming in through a little loud in the room. Can I ask you to speak a little softly, a little further from your microphone? Thank you. But we understood what you were saying. Sorry. To you, Jennifer.
Yeah, so whether something is sending data limited, that would be if it's application limited, which I think would just be a formula based on whether the client send buffers are growing or whether they are remaining at a decent pace. And basically, and you also get an estimated send rate number back here. So it's meant to be, I guess, complementary information to that. So that if you get a very low send rate, you might have questions. Well, why is it so low? Is it because, is it network limited? Is it because I'm not sending enough data? Because that's the issue, is that I think it's hard to report an estimate. If you're not sending any data, it's hard to give an estimate. And that could be the reason.
Yeah. Okay.
And for whether the server is overloaded, well, you guys tell me. I understand there's some feedback mechanisms in the protocol, and I think
that's coming from
if the server is, so that I don't know if those are blocked frames exactly or how that works. But the idea would be to know if you're dealing with a server that is overloaded based on.
Okay, so it would be flow control based.
Correct.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that should be possible to extract. Okay, thank you.
All right, great.
Yeah, Eric Kinnear. So this seems like a lot of the transport part of the web transport. And so I think this really is a room that we'd want to pay attention to this slide. The thing that my understanding of what these are for is to say the estimated send rate is some number of how fast we think things are leaving the device. And the useful thing that you could do with that is know, should I send at the same rate? Should I keep enqueuing data more slowly than I am right now because I'm going too fast? Or should I enqueue even more data because that estimated send rate is lying to me, because if I were to try, it might go up. And so I think these Booleans that we have here are essentially a signal to let you know why you might choose to make that choice, rather than just being interesting for funsies. So the 2 questions that I think we really want to be able to answer, either in this room, or we might even bring some of this to like TSVWG tomorrow morning, or ICCRG or something like that. CCWG would be great, but it was not it's already happened. But we can certainly ask on the list. But I think that the two questions are very much what Magnus just asked, which is it possible to get correct answers to these, right? Because there's a lot of things that we don't know. Unless you try to send, we don't necessarily know if there is room to send more. And so we don't want to give people Boolean that says, hey, you should try to send more. What we can say is you shouldn't try to send more because we know that you are, currently blocked on flow control, and if you try to send more, it's just going to get queued. Similarly, if you are data limited or in slow start, you could try to send more, and there's a reasonable chance that your estimated send rate will increase as you send more. But I think this is one of those things that like a lot of media people and a lot of other folks who are planning on using WebTransport are going to be spending a huge amount of time becoming very good friends with these, and our goal should be to not mislead them.
Thanks.
Christian Wittemer, I would like that you be very clear about what information, what signals you want and why. I am a bit concerned that you are building an API based on some kind of internal model you have of what congestion control does and how it operates. And there are many different congestion control algorithms, and they don't necessarily have the same notions. For example, take something like iStart++, which is a variation of the cubic start. It has a slow start phase, and it also has a slower start phase. And there are concepts like that. So I think that the API, instead of being congestion-centric, should be customer-centric. You want to understand whether you can send faster. You want to understand whether you should send slower. You would understand but you should do the API based on that, because basing an API on a model of the congestion control machine is making assumption about how that machine is built, and those assumptions will probably never be true for all the congestion control that are being applied. Apart from that, what Eric said was, yeah, I mean, if you do an API like that, you will want to pass it through the control congestion working group, which is doing that.
All right, thank you. That's great feedback.
Matt Mathis, amongst other things, I'm the first author on the TCP extended statistics MIB, which included exactly this kind of metrics. And as far as I'm concerned, one of the things that we did to make our job easier is we made the specifications for the metrics fairly general, and the RFC specifically said you had to understand the implementation to know exactly what they meant, which is sort of an out for Christian's question. However, sending limited turned out to be super complicated, and we never got it right. And the reason it's super complicated is you get into situations where you can't tell what's going on in the sender because there's a priority inversion in the sender itself. And so you end up not having data from the application because you're doing something high priority to move data on the wire. And you get, because of problems like that, it's wonderful to imagine these things working, and I hope you can get them to work, but don't be surprised if they don't work.
Thanks.
Not to get back in line, but to Matt's point, I think I'm in a similar boat of when we first started talking about this, it was like, holy crap, what are we doing here? And if we can find a tightly enough scoped, if the Venn diagram between things that are possible and real and things that would actually be useful to someone, if those are not two completely distinct circles, then I think we're trying to make that be this list. So like, is sending data limited is arguably some variant of either just is bytes in flight less than the congestion window, and or have you denied any bytes in the last time quantum? And if you haven't denied any bytes, then maybe now's a good time to try. Yes. And so like we talked about that maybe being a part of the API, and then that seemed really crazy.
Also, to turn the question around, let's say we didn't provide any of these. Would that be upsetting to anyone? Because we don't want to build this just because we can, and we are looking for feedback. if
mock.
people really want this or not, or whether an estimated send rate by itself is useful.
I echo that question towards our mock friends. Hello, mock chair.
And jumping in
Not to put you
as
on the spot.
chair, Yanivar, do you know if there are requests for this information on the W3C side of things?
I think, was it Victor that raised this initially? But we don't have a lot of outside input yet.
I will say that one of the biggest concerns that we've heard from folks who would otherwise be good adopters of WebTransport and mock and other quick things is that the information that you get today when you write your own UDP packets and build your own congestion controller as a completely separate thing from all the other congestion controllers is going to be missing, and that one of the biggest sources of consternation is, yes, I know I get datagrams, and yes, I know they're not reliable, but they're still congestion controlled, and that is of huge concern to people. So as much as I personally am like, what are we doing here? That may be a blocker for a lot of people.
Thank you.
Yeah, our imagined use for the extended statistics MIB was as a general diagnostic facility. And to the first approximation, you'd love to know if it's the sending side, the network, or the receiving side that's the bottleneck. But it turned out to be useful for that in only a restricted class of applications, particularly because transactional data looks completely weird, and sort of bulk indicators of which side is the bottleneck tells you nothing. It tells you who is idle.
Thanks. And as a reminder, please state your name to make our scribe's life easier. That was Matt Mathis.
Christian Wittema. I understand why the application wants to have a general idea of how fast the network can go. I mean, that means, for example, how many video streams can you open and things like that. People want to know that. So yeah, there is some kind of request there. In reality, the only valuable information is what you get when you try. And you may get some information as in, I'm queuing data on that stream. What's the ETA for them to leave? Or is there already a queue building up on that particular stream? And the information will be different based on different priorities and the relative priorities of the stream. Now, I'll throw you one issue there. We are going to see use of multipass at the transport layer. Each multipass, each of the multiple paths have their own congestion control. So trying to abstract that can be really hard. So we have a tension there. And I understand that you are building a model so that basically people can build some piece of JavaScript and have it ported in various environments and it still works. But there is a huge tension between having precise information, which depends a lot on the implementation, and having useful information. I think that if I was to do that, what I would try to do is provide information tied to the API, tied to, I am trying to write on that stream, how long would it take, or what is the queue, or something, what is that, something that can be measured, something that gives you information about the underlying network.
Did you? Sure.
Not to be at the mic again, because I think it's potentially worth the faceplant on this, just given how blocked things have been. To Christian's point, the goal in my mind here isn't to say, how fast could you send? I think the thing that we can say is, this is how fast things are going out right now, which is a little bit different from this is how fast you are in queuing them. Right? This isn't how fast are you calling send on them. This is how fast are they actually leaving the device. And for a limited set of use cases, this is a place where we know that either is bound, that this is a floor or that this is a ceiling. So we're not ever going to try to say, we think you could go this fast on this network. What we're going to say instead is, this is how fast you are currently going. And either we know nothing, you might consider trying, or I happen to know for sure that if you put more data into this pipe, it's not going to leave the device any faster. So like if there's a way to scope this to just the places where we actually know for sure that it's not going to change if you try, then that might be a tractable scoping.
Jonathan Lennox, yeah, looking over the link somebody sent to Victor's initial request, it sounds like what he's actually asking for is, you know, is the number I'm getting for the estimated send rate, is this something where you've actually bumped into congestion and thus this is probably ceiling-ish? Or is this something where you've never seen it and you're still in some exploratory phase or whatever? So that's something which is A, kind of actionable, and B, probably kind of usable. I mean, there's still a lot of questions about what time scale you're looking at and whatnot, which would have to be very hand wavy. But I think, you know, is this something where you've hit a ceiling or is it not? Is something that is potentially useful and achievable.
Harald Alvestrom. Trying to remember that the TCP model was designed for file transfer, where you had plenty of time and delays didn't matter. We are trying to use this stuff in cases where delay is the most important characteristic and where we have the chance to adapt the amount of data based on how that affects the delay. Exposing this stuff, even if we can't make it perfect, at least gives us the chance to learn and iterate so that we can produce systems that are better suited for the user in the case where delay matters and we can adjust the number of bytes that we need to send.
Christian Ritema again. I'm not going to revisit what we just said, but seeing something that you are saying, anything missing. One particular thing that might be very useful is an event going from the congestion controller to the application saying that, hey, things have changed. And in particular, we just lost a link, or our throughput was divided by 10 or something like that, which is an event to which the application needs to respond. And that does happen. We see that in practice, and it's probably a useful event to understand.
All right, looks like we've drained the queue. If you want to go on to the next slide.
All right, next slide, please. And this is the hardest problem in API design, which is byte shedding. So we have in the HTTP 3 draft, we have WebTransport subprotocols available. If we compare that to WebSockets, WebSockets talks about subprotocols in the text, but has the request header field sec WebSocket protocol, not subprotocol. And the spec talks about the protocols field, but says subprotocols in the text. And in the IANA registry, we have protocol header field. And then, yeah, there's basically a lot of mixing here between terms. So, and also, we're trying to add a constructor argument to new WebTransport, which is basically an array of strings that are subprotocols you can use. So right now, the current favorite name for that is subprotocols to match the IETF spec. The IETF terminology. The alternative might be to call it protocols, which would match, be more consistent with WebSockets perhaps. Or we could call it something else, like application level protocols. So right now, I think we're just going to call it subprotocols unless the IETF decides to change their terminology. We're not sure that's the best idea, but it's a good tiebreaker. Any thoughts on this? Well, I should also say that part of the issue here is that these specs talk about protocols a lot. So, but that's perhaps more of an editorial problem rather than just an API problem.
All right, we have two people in the queue. Nidhi, go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Hi, Nidhi. I'm one of the W3C editors. So just to get some context, we left as subprotocols to match the IETF side because it didn't seem great to call it two different things in the specs. And subprotocol kind of implies to me that it's like the underlying protocol. And as Yanivar mentioned, protocol is a very overloaded word. And I think this is the application level protocol actually. So but that name itself feels very long. So not to add another option, but how do people feel about application protocol?
All right, does anyone have thoughts on that one? I think I see Matt next in the queue.
I actually just wanted to ask a clarifying question. Is the IANA language, registry language mutable? Do we know?
Answer that.
All things are mutable?
You mean the one for WebSocket or for WebTransport?
Well, it would be useful if the language was uniform everywhere.
Well, so I mean, sorry, jumping in, I think anything related to WebSocket, like that ship has sailed for in a lot of regards, whereas anything related to WebTransport, the world is our oyster, we can do whatever we want. Eric?
That ship has already sunk. Yeah, I think even trying to be consistent, like the existing IANA registry for WebSocket is not consistent with the WebSocket spec. So I would strongly like to have the W3C spec and the IETF spec match, so at least we aren't in the same bad spot. Application protocols sounds fine to me. It's weird to call it a sub protocol when it is the protocol running closer to the application than the thing that you're running. But right, I don't really want to like get deeply into which one is the top and which one isn't, but application is a nice thing that everybody agrees on where it is and what it doesn't matter whether that's up or down. So I would be perfectly happy with that.
Thanks, Christian.
A word of caution on application level protocol, because it's also already used in TLS. And there is a class of usage in which applications are designed to run either on WebTransport or directly on top of Quick. And when they are running directly on top of Quick, that application is identified by an ALPN. And I am concerned that we should only use the same name if we mean exactly the same thing, because there is a domain of overlap there.
So Christian, before you walk away, do you have sounds like you don't like application protocol. Is there something you do like?
I don't mind application level protocols if the expectation is that we use exactly the same name if we run the application directly on top of Quick. I mean, that's a usage that we do see, okay? In MOQ, for example, there are the two versions supported, one over WebTransport and one directly on top of Quick. When running directly on top of Quick, people are going to use an ALPN to identify their application. So either we mean to exactly specify that, or we use a different name. That's all.
Thanks. Harold?
Just a comment that those who think that application is a well-defined place in the stack have rarely built one. I mean, a browser and running a JavaScript page, you will find several people with several different opinions on where the application is. But in the interest of API ergonomics, please pick a short name, toss a coin, I don't care. But pick one, stay with it.
All right. Thanks. Sounds like we have drained the queue. I don't think we have a specific one, but I think I've heard quite a few people talk about unifying on the same term. So I would say either reuse potentially the IETF one, or we could open an issue on the IETF one to change that. Yanivar, based on if you have feelings.
Again, bike shedding is the hardest part, so I don't know if we. I guess we can flip a coin in the room. I don't know. But thank you. That was good feedback.
Tell you what, it sounds like I've heard support for protocol and sub-protocol, and some folks opposed to application protocol. So maybe I'm going to do a quick poll between protocol and sub-protocol, or do we want to do, oh, we can do 3 now with the polls. Let's do that. And then we're just going to see where that lands. 1 second.
So just to be clear, option 1 is sub protocols, 2 is protocols, and 3 is application protocols. And nobody wants to type a level because that's annoying.
I'm typing it in
Cool.
because otherwise we're
Thank you.
confused. All right, so yes is protocol, no is sub-protocol, and no opinion is application protocol. No, so if you don't vote, it doesn't get to no opinion. It doesn't say anything. The tools strike again. No. Let's do this again. Everyone has to vote again. Sorry, I don't know how that happened. My mouse wasn't hovering over the button. All right, I'm going to close it in 5 seconds. And of course, when I close it, it removes it from the screen. Great. For the minutes, Dustin, if you can write that we had 19 votes for protocol, 3 for sub-protocol, and 9 for application protocol. Yanivar, can I ask you to file an issue on our tracker for the rename, and we'll discuss it on the list to make sure we have consensus on that. But that sounds like an ideally we could just do that and move on.
Great, we'll do. Thank you.
Otherwise,
that was my last slide.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Eric, you're next. And if there's too much discussion on the issue about bike sheds, I will bring back my AI-generated bike sheds. Wait, I guess this isn't working the way I expected.
Please do.
Too soon.
It's going to be easier than figuring out the mic stand. Yeah. Cool. All right. Next slide or I requested slide control. It's all good either way.
It's just leave for not doing it. It's easiest.
That makes life easy. Cool. All right. This is me with my hat as opposed to me with my Victor hat, but it's not that different, so life is good. Yeah. Let's talk about WebTransport over H2. We did a thing in H3 where we defined key exporters because people wanted key exporters, and so we gave a label and filled in the other necessary fields to define one and landed some changes that include a key exporter for H3. I'm going to go out on a limb here and assume that nobody's like, it was fine for H3, but there's some drastic problem with doing it in H2. But if there is, now's the time to speak up. Delightfully quiet.
Yeah.
Cool. So that,
just a clarifying question, Eric. Do you see any reason it should be different?
no, not even slightly.
Okay.
I mean, the label probably needs to be different. Like it probably shouldn't have the 3 in it. We should probably change the 3 to a 2.
But yeah.
But other than that, that is the other challenge. So I believe what this means is that the W3C side of the world needs to make this failable. But I don't think it changes anything for our land. We define it for where it works, and if it works, it works. And if it doesn't, when you ask for it, you don't get it because that's not a thing for you. That would be great. Thank you.
Jonathan Maddox, yes, my comment off mic was that H2 can be TLS1 too, unlike H3. And I guess key exporters don't exist in TLS1 too, or do they?
Let me jump in. I know the answer here. So they exist in 1.2.
Mm-hmm.
They're just considered unsafe unless you have the extended master secret extension enabled. So what we did for concealed authentication, which was an HTTP draft, was to say that you cannot use it unless you have either HTTP 3 or later, or TLS 1.3, sorry, or later, or TLS 1.2 with the extended master secret enabled. And our options here, I would see, are either to say that at the W3C layer, this API can fail, or we can say that WebTransport over H2 requires these requirements, which, to be fair, unless you have those, your TLS security has some pretty gaping holes. So that wouldn't be a ridiculous requirement. Speaking in all this, I'm saying as individual contributor, by the way.
That's an interesting one. So we would add another implicit requirement in addition to all the other extensions that you have to have and everything else. We'd say, unless you do this, you shall not try WebTransport over H2, or any WebTransport really. Is that a decision that we're willing to make?
Yaroslav Rosomaho, Zscaler. One thing that is not necessarily specific to key exporter in HTTP2, but key exporter available through API on the client side in general, I believe that's the first occurrence when key exporters can be available to JavaScript-based applications that run in web browsers. So previously, I don't believe there is any API for things that run inside web browser to get access to key exporter. And things might break if there is a proxy in between that is performing TLS decryption, which is, again, perfectly fine. But perhaps that needs to be noted in the spec for application developers to be aware of this possibility.
Thank you, yeah.
Yaroslav, can I ask you to file an issue on our GitHub for what you just said? That way we make sure we keep track of it. Thank you.
That'd be really good. All right, sounds like next slide. Use some new settings. So we have an issue to bring all of the changes that we made to the settings the last time. We're on like round 3 or 4 or 5 of exactly what combinations of who sends what tells us things about WebTransport. If we go to the next slide, I thought it might be useful if we talked a little bit about where we ended up rather than just do the same as H3, because like it's nice to do the same as H3, but in this case, it's not quite the same. So everything that is struck through, you'll notice things like settings H3 datagram. That's an H3 thing. So what this means for H2 is that the server only is going to send max sessions. So at one point in our fun history, meeting or 3 ago, we decided that both sides had to send this so that everybody was opting into using WebTransport. And we had a discussion at the last IETF about how that required people to buffer and or delayed their ability to get started on doing things. When you first open a WebTransport session, you want to be able to like then actually open streams and open sessions and do all that kind of stuff. So we switched back. In H3, you have settings WebTransport max sessions is now sent only by the server. The proposal here is to make H2 do the same thing. except we don't have quite the same set of restrictions because in H3 things can show up out of order. Whereas in H2, we have this very nice ordered pipe, and it turns out that makes life a lot easier. So we don't necessarily have to buffer WebTransport requests until the client settings show up, because the client doesn't get to send those requests until it's sent the settings. And those requests therefore cannot arrive at the server before the settings because these things are ordered. So that is the struct through text there. And then we don't need to turn on settings H3 datagram to turn on HTTP3 datagrams because that isn't a thing for H2. So we get completely rid of that. But while we're talking about it, just so everybody has the whole picture in their mind, an H3 server does need to be able to handle connect requests coming in to establish a new WebTransport session before they know necessarily whether WebTransport's even supported or if anybody's doing anything with it or anything like that. So you've got these requests coming in that you need to be able to basically sit on. Next slide, please. If we collapse those so we can look at the third part of this, we do still need to do settings enable connect protocol for everybody. So that's part of how you know that you're willing to speak that connect that comes in to open the WebTransport session. And you're not just like, what the heck are these bytes? I need to buffer them. So you at least know what they are. You might not talk the token that is in the protocol field here. So you may not speak the WebTransport session format or version that is trying to be established, but you at least know what you're looking at and you know how to successfully discard it if it's not something that you want, or you know how to reject it if it's not something that you can speak. So I think this makes sense for H2. It will end up looking exactly the same as H3, except minus the H3 datagram part, which is not necessary for H2. But I thought it'd be nice if we talked a little bit about where we ended up after flip-flopping like 3 times. All right, next slide. This wall of text, you're more than welcome to read. If we go to the next slide, I'm going to make it a little easier to read. You can skip those parts. So, I mean, we can cross it all out. But fundamentally, what we're saying is, because settings are sent immediately for H2, you don't have this weird ordering inversion. You still are in a situation where you need to all agree about what version you're speaking for everything. So with connect, that's really nice. We have the protocol field that you're giving a string in that has a token that represents that version of WebTransport. And we've made some commitments about what future versions of WebTransport we're doing. And that's why we're bothering to talk about it so much right now, is the choices we make here don't just affect this WebTransport, it affects how we evolve it in the future, so that we don't accidentally paint ourselves into a corner. Next slide, please. I turned this into bullets so you didn't actually have to read the whole thing. There's 3 main things that we might change. We might change the syntax of what we put in the extended connect, or if there's the other additional headers that we include in that connect for initial settings and things for WebTransport. If we do that, we can't use WebTransport, the upgrade token. We make it WebTransport 2, the upgrade token. At that point, when somebody comes in, they can say, hey, I don't talk WebTransport 2, what the heck? And then they can reject it. If we end up changing the frame format, the capsules in some way that isn't additive or otherwise backwards compatible on its own, if we say, hey, this is a whole different thing, and this byte that was totally valid in the past is now completely valid and opposite in meaning, which we don't usually do, but just in case, we end up changing the max sessions code point that the server is going to send to the client. And because the client is the only one that gets to kick things off by initiating a WebTransport session, that's totally fine because the server is not able to unsolicited send you a version specific thing as a client. So the client waits for that setting to come in from the server. And if there is a different format of the thing that you would send to kick stuff off, we use a different code point for that. And at that point, we now have one code point for WebTransport 1, one code point for WebTransport 2, and we're fine. All of this is the same for H3 and H2. Finally, if we have the incompatible stream format, next slide, please. That is only H3 specific. And we have a unidirectional stream type and a signal value that we send on bidirectional streams. We will need to change both of those so that if those arrive out of order in H3, you can say, huh, this isn't the version that I'm expecting. I don't know what to do with this, and I should blow up and otherwise be sad. But those are the 3 main parts that we've identified where things might change. And we believe that all of those are fine. We can be consistent with them across H3 and H2. It's just some of them don't apply to H2 because life is easier if things don't show up in random orders. Could I get a general sense of a thumbs up, thumbs down if people are at all like, yes, this seems reasonable, or like, OMG, no, I'm totally lost? right, we got a couple of thumbs up. I love that. It's okay to say thumbs down too, like there's no judgment. Next slide, please.
And you might have lost a few people, but at least it didn't sound ridiculous to anyone. I only saw thumbs up.
That works for me.
I
appreciate it. That we call trust.
Yeah, to repeat it at the mic, Jonathan said he's lost, but he trusts. He thinks it's okay anyway. Sorry.
All right, next slide. What's next? Oh, that was too many next slides. Thank you. What's next? You might notice something about this slide. It's empty. So that's the end of the issues. Everything else either is, has a PR, is done, doesn't need input, is ready to go. So other than being snarky about the fact that there's nothing next and we're totally done, what I think is actually next is implementations. We need to actually interoperate. We need to make sure that this works. We need to try it out. We need to give it a shot. Exactly. So I know that we're working on and close to an implementation. We've interoperated in past versions and things, so we need to make sure that everything's super up to date with all these changes. Some of them are obviously in flight, so nobody's up to date on them yet. I believe if Victor were here, he'd be giving an update about his side of things. Do you have any?
I knew he was working on it. I don't know how far he got since last time.
In the hallway before earlier this week, he mentioned that he was very close to being done.
Oh, awesome.
And thought that things were generally working. So that gives us at least two fairly large implementations that should be able to interoperate at some point soon. Randall.
Yes, Mozilla is planning to implement WebTransport over H2. I think the time frame is like 6 months-ish. We have not actually started implementation yet.
Lovely, thank you. Yeah,
awesome. Thank you for sharing.
We are looking forward to interoperating. We'll do a bunch of tests and define our fun little interop matrix and stuff like that. But that is a wonderful update. Thank you, Randall.
Oh yeah, we haven't done an interop matrix in a while. So yeah, are you done? So in terms of what's next for this draft, like I think on the key material exporters, let's have some discussion on the issue because there are two options there, but I think we can easily pick one. On the other ones, we know what to write in the PRs, so those will be reviewed by folks on GitHub and then brought to the list. But our plan, assuming this works, is that we land all of those, publish a new draft version, and that will then be the interop target. And so from a working group process perspective, then we will kind of put it on hold until we have multiple implementations. Our goal is to generally, anytime we interop with these, we either find bugs in the protocol or at least find bits of the spec that are unclear and could be improved. So there will be a round of changes that comes out of that. And I think after that, assuming there weren't any too serious issues and they were easy to fix, then we'll launch working group last call. So we're in pretty good shape. I would say we probably, I would aim to have the interop target before Dublin, so folks can work on it before and then potentially try to interop at the hackathon. That would be really great.
That would be fantastic, yeah.
All right, then I would say next slide. And Eric, put your Victor hat on.
Hi, everybody. I'm Victor. I'm going to put on my mask, my sideburns. All right. So I totally didn't make these slides. Let's talk about some cool slides. So overview issue number 13 is about changing what data received means. Please do go click that link on your copy of the slides. Essentially what we're talking about is saying in Quick, you have a state that says data received, but especially in H2, really we're saying all data that we're going to send has been in-queued for sending. And that's about as far as we know. Like it might be sitting in a kernel buffer somewhere. And once you've said goodbye to it, it's out there. It might be retransmitted for you. It might be sitting somewhere in the network. We're not trying to make guarantees about whether we've sent everything or not. So the cutoff point is I'm going to declare that I have sent all of the data such that if you were to nuke the stream out from under me, I don't care anymore. And so this is basically making a generic version of that from Quick. So as close as we can get to the concept of Quick's data received state, we're trying to define what is the commonality between quick and non-quick transports that gets you the same concept of, hey, I'm done and I've sent you everything that I'm going to send, and if you were to take the stream away, it's all good. But there has been some interesting discussion on that PR. So this is just a PSA to go click on that link and read the PR. And if it confuses you, now is the time to speak up.
I'm seeing Mike jump in and out of the queue.
Yeah.
I have questions, but I was going to go read the PR. So in quick, the data received state is all acts have been received, and that's not something that is necessarily exposed to the exposed to the application layer.
Yeah.
So is this specific to H2, or is this for the H3 as well? Because
this is for the overview doc. So we're walking back from all the data that I've sent has been acknowledged, and instead saying all of the data that I'm planning to send has been in-queued, and it is now somebody else's responsibility to get it there. So for quick, that can still match to everything's been act, especially for unreliable data. And then for H2, there is no unreliable data. And so we believe that once you've in-queued it, barring the whole connection going away, there's no way to not have it get there.
Right. So in quick, that state is data sent. And then there's a subsequent transition to data received.
Ooh, I like that. So maybe if we're gonna, rather than claiming that we're making a analogous common version for data received, we should really just say, let's walk that back to data sent and call it a day.
Perhaps. So the difference is that if you were to send a reset stream in quick in the data received state, you're not guaranteed that all data gets delivered.
Because it might still be sitting on the receiver side and not yet delivered to the application.
Or it might get dropped and have to be retransmitted.
Got it. Thank you. Okay. Yeah. If you don't mind leaving that as a comment on the PR as well,
Sure.
just to make sure we don't lose it. But yeah, thank you.
Matt Mathis, I sense a lot of danger there because of ambiguities between closing a connection as an abort and closing a connection as an EOF. And particularly if you use the term data sent, data received, it will cause programmers to make incorrect assumptions about what that means. And that's likely to cause bugs that will haunt people for a long time because I think something was done when it wasn't.
Very much, yeah. I think the concrete proposal is instead of saying data received, it's to say that all of the data has been in-queued.
Yes.
Committed.
The correct cement.
Committed. All data committed is the new name.
Is it committed?
That's what the PR says. So if it's not committed, I got a comment for you.
Yeah. So if there is a way that a dereference on a null pointer can cause it not to be sent, it wasn't committed.
I think that would end up being a kernel panic for many people, but yes.
And a blue screen.
Oh.
Too soon. But yes, thank you. Cool. All right, so we've got some comments to please also leave on the PR, just to make sure that we get those back there, and Victor will also take a look at those. And next slide, please. All right, we have a PR in review to update the name of sub-protocol, but we just did some fun with names. I think we've talked about that already, so let's keep going. Next slide, please. Capabilities. So we're just going through all of the open issues.
Actually, just 1 second. Go back 1 slide, please. Just jumping in as chair, I think one item that we did discuss is potentially switching the name to protocol. I'm making the assumption that in the overview in H2 and H3, we're going to use the same name. And if someone disagrees with that, please go and say something. But otherwise, we're going to strive for consistency. And I just wanted to give anyone a chance to object on that because I think we're all on the same page. Okay, good. All right. You can move on to the next one.
Thank you. Yes, please, consistency. All right, capabilities. So this is as Victor says, it's mostly a tracking issue. We've discovered a number of places where the W3C spec was referencing the H3 spec because something did not exist in the overview that needed to be common between different transports. So we need to go through and do one more audit of, hey, here is transport capability X that we're offering people, and having the W3C spec only referencing the overview doc has been a very nice forcing function to make sure that we aren't missing anything there. So if anybody's aware of any of those, feel free to shout. But otherwise, I think this is more of just so everybody's aware that we're doing that. All right, auth. This is a fun one. We could spend a long time talking about this. So we say that WebTransport does not support HTTP-based auth. We are, however, running WebTransport over HTTP. HTTP offers authentication. We are talking about resources and things like that. Thoughts, feelings, TLS client certs continue to be a thing. Do we still think it's true that you shouldn't be able to do any kind of authentication with HTTP, whether those are cookies or HTTP authentication schemes or TLS client certs? I have a personal opinion, which is that like it's a little weird that we don't, because like this is just regular HTTP with extended connect on it. But Mike.
Yeah, I'm having trouble seeing why we would need that requirement or prohibition. And maybe there's a good reason that we've forgotten about, but if we don't remember why we put this in, maybe some review of history would be good.
Jonathan says, not at the microphone and not in the queue, that it didn't always used to be over HTTP. And I think when we made it over HTTP, we were trying to be careful to not pull in too much extra stuff for folks who were nervous about having an HTTP stack in their midst. But I think we would not necessarily require auth, but I think it's a little weird to prohibit it. If you're gonna implement a stack that isn't actually HTTP, that's totally fine. But if you're doing that, you almost certainly know who you're talking to. And if you want to not support auth, then like, don't. So I would personally, I agree with Mike. Let's use the issue to go through and do that digging into both why we added this and if we had some bright idea then. It doesn't sound like there's anybody in the room here who's particularly attached to it. And so if we wanted to remove that prohibition and simply leave it open for future interpretation, then we'd be in good shape. Anybody doing this in a browser context with the web API almost certainly has an HTTP stack because they're a browser. And anybody who's not doing this in that space almost certainly knows who they're talking to and what they're doing it with. All right, next slide, please. Drain. So this is a fun one because I know Victor has deeply held opinions on this with which I wholeheartedly disagree. So I'm going to stand over here and speak as myself, and I'm going to stand over here and speak as Victor. So we had a conversation at one point about whether or not we still needed drain web transport session and whether or not it was enforced somewhere or somewhere else. And standing on this side as Victor, he was saying, yes, we want to expose this because it's a signal to applications to let them know that they can start to drain things, kind of similar to go away, where you basically say, hey, I'd like to gracefully close. Please start wrapping things up, wind it all down, keep on going. And we asked the question, is this actually enforced? And Victor's response was, it's a signal for the application to use to do whatever it wants with. And so when we talk about how we define the application, did that mean the W3C API or the actual JavaScript running in the browser or somebody else? So we have a Bernard.
Yeah, I think there's two separable questions here. One is whether the protocol should include drain web transport session. And I think Alan has made the argument that one of the scenarios for this is actually more on the server side. So it wouldn't, and then the second question is whether the W3C API needs it for a browser to make that available. I think those are two separable decisions.
Got it. So when you say, I see, well, Alan's in the queue, so we'll let him go when we get there, but yeah.
Alan Frindell, draining enthusiast.
Weird.
Yeah, I know less about the API side and whether you need this in the API, but I imagine cases similar to if you were in HTTP and heard David's wrap-up capsule presentation. I think there are cases where you have intermediaries. When the intermediaries go away, they would like to send this, someone in the middle wants to send this in one direction or the other to let so that ultimately an endpoint finds out that like this thing is going away and I need to wrap it up. And that's a useful signal. And I even suggested in HTTP that maybe this and wrap up could become the same thing. Maybe, I don't know.
That could be nice. I see. So what we're saying is that there is a use case for drain, and we think it is a good signal that gives useful information.
I think so. I don't know. If you don't think it's a useful signal,
Standing on this side, I agree, and I think Victor does too. So
Victor's not here. We can make him say whatever we want.
Love it. Bernard.
Yeah, so that's kind of the answer to the protocol question, I guess, which is really what's in the IETF's purview. I guess the other question is whether we think this is a useful thing for a browser to send.
I mean, I'll jump back in and say, like, I imagine that you're doing like a live stream over or some other kind of streaming thing from the server is streaming to you and the client's like going to go away but I'd like to get to the end of something. I don't know, just like, hey, wrap it up, since we have like wrap up language now, but like I'm going away soon, but I want this to end cleanly and not an error, because I can always just close that session, right? Right. Like, whatever, session is gone. But if it's like, well, I want to go away, but I got a little bit of time, like let's get to the end of whatever we're doing. Like I think that can be useful. Now, I think the counterpoint, if Martin was here, he'd probably say like, then the application can do that in its own. It doesn't need a generic facility. And I don't know, maybe there's an argument for that. But for the general like like the intermediary can't do that at the endpoint.
So having it a way to say, please don't do anything new, but like finish up what you're doing, go away style.
I mean, we removed go away from quick. We don't have it but we have it in HTTP 3, I think, with sort of the same set of logic. So I can sort of see why you'd want to remove that.
Gotcha.
All right, I'm realizing we're speculating a little bit with Martin and Victor being virtually or imaginatively in the room. But let's.
I can stand in a third place.
All right, let's have Nidhi, who's actually here virtually.
So I think I might be understanding this wrong, but go away is meant for like all the web transport sessions to be gracefully shut down, whereas I think drain was meant to be shutting down a single web transport session. But in the text, we just say like an endpoint may continue to use the session and we may open new streams, and it's kind of up to the application. So I don't know, especially on the client initiated drain side, we're not really enforcing anything. So I'm not really sure like what the signal is that the application is, like what the browser is really supposed to be doing with it at that point.
Yeah, so if I'm understanding you correctly, in the W3C API, once a drain has gone, you can still open new streams.
So just to jump in as chair here, because I realize we're a little confused because like the person who made the slide isn't in the room. I was reading through the W3C issue and the IETF issue on GitHub for both of these, and neither of them actually talk about removing drain web transport session. They only talk about not using it in the client to server direction. I don't think is anyone actually suggesting to remove it in the server to client direction?
I mean, I did if you're not a person.
Yeah, it's server to client is fine.
Yeah.
I don't even think necessarily the argument is against removing the protocol capability in client to server direction either, because of the reasons Alan described.
Okay, so I just still jumping in as chair. Am I hearing correctly that there might be people could live with just keeping it at the IETF layer, that it could go in both directions, and then at the W3C layer they could say in the there's no API to send it from client to server, or is that something that doesn't quite work for you, Eric?
I don't think that is an outcome that we could choose. I think a better outcome from my perspective would be that we would have the W3C API actually enforce that you can't open new streams after you've said drain. And the question became
after you sent or received, sorry,
sent as a client. So the client to server direction here.
Oh, okay.
If I said, hey, drain, or potentially if one arrives from the server, we can talk about that. But fundamentally, the assertion was made that in the IETF spec, we wrote the application gets to choose what to do with this drain signal. And there was a request for clarification of, okay, great. So as we're defining the web API for this, like, it seems somewhat logical that if I were to write a unit test and I say, hey, I'd like to do a thing, and then a signal arrives that says, or I send a signal that says, no more new things, and then I try to make new thing, that should probably like fail.
Yeah, I'm realizing that Christian was right in the sense that we didn't clearly define what the application was.
Yes. So
All
this
right,
was a request for clarification.
Let's resume the queue. Yeah. So Mike.
So I was wanting to push a little more on what Alan had said about combining this with the wrap-up capsule draft. I understand that it is useful for WebTransport and it is involved in the API, but it feels kind of silly to make two things with one of them being general and one of them being WebTransport specific when they mean the same thing. Should we just merge this with David's draft and let the WebTransport, like, not deal with it in the WebTransport protocol, but W3C can trigger sending it?
Just jumping in as chair, in terms of process, the wrap-up draft that I happen to be an author on isn't adopted by the HTTP working group, and like adding a dependency on an adopted draft would add like significant process delays. So speaking as chair, I think in the interest of finishing this, it would make sense to have something in WebTransport, even if what we end up having over there ends up being similar. Capsule types are cheap.
Could I suggest that we have a official request for the WebTransport chairs to check in with the HTTP chairs and say, hey, like, we as a working group would be interested in having a dependency on this document. Are you planning on doing anything with it? And if their answer is no, then we say, great, this is a subsequent capsule. If they say yes, and we'll make it in time for your interop matrix to be filled in, then we say, let's talk about it.
Or for that matter, we rename this one and have the other draft say you can use it in non-WebTransport cases.
Ooh.
All right. I mean, I have technical opinions as an individual contributor, but so I'll join the queue later. Okay. Let's see what everyone else thinks about. This is another option that we could do. So Matt, you're next.
Yes, I have to admit I'm not familiar enough with the protocols to get into the details, but I wanted to strongly encourage you to think about being functionally complete at the protocol layer, even if the recommendation is at the API layer is not to choose to be complete. One of the things that Measurement Lab supports are some measurement tools that use WebSockets. And one of the problems that we have with WebSockets is across all the platforms, there is a lot of ambiguity and non-uniformity about treatment and perhaps canceling of non-transmitted data. The problem is, for a performance measurement tool, you want to shovel data as fast as you can, and then when you've decided you're done measuring, in order to send the report, you'd like to cancel the data you've already queued. And you can't do that. And the point is, if the protocol isn't functionally complete, it can never be added to the API. If the protocol is functionally complete, you can then later, there's an open decision in the API to add the feature later.
Yeah, thank you. I like that. Lucas.
Yeah, just to echo what other people have said, I think we shouldn't arbitrarily restrict the direction of this drain message. But if you wanted to do it at the API or the application, then sure, do that if you like. On the topic of whether there should be drain WebTransport or wrap-up capsule or something, I think even if you did it as a wrap-up capsule, you still have to write sufficient text about what draining WebTransport means anyway. So I think just do what we're doing, and then in the future, if wrap-up comes along, then we say an update document to this that says, oh, it could be either this capsule or a different capsule. It's still the same draining mechanism. But I'm a strong supporter of allowing intermediaries that act as clients to be able to do things that web browsers don't necessarily need to do. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Alan Frindell, I wanted to come to what you were saying about what you can do after you've sent or received one of these things. And I think I wrote the original text for this and said, and I had language in there that was similar to sort of what happens in HTTP when you get a go away, which is like, after you send or receive this, you can't do streams. And then somebody made me take it out because the application is the one that knows what it means to wrap up. And maybe to wrap up, they have to open a new stream that says we're going away gracefully or something. And so that's why it kind of like I think.
Right. And I think that's where we ended
somebody
up.
Not in the room probably made me do that.
Yeah.
But originally I had it the way, I mean, there's an intuitive reason why you're in the same thought that I did. It was like, yeah, okay, just don't make new streams, but we don't know what people are using this thing for. So I don't think we can do that, which means the text is very wishy-washy, but the signal can still be there. And every application's like, okay, I'm supposed to go away. And they get to define what that means.
If I'm standing on the Eric side of this line, I would be in a place where I'd say, okay, like let's make the signal, let's define what the behavior is. And if that behavior doesn't work for you because you need to open a new stream, then by all means, send your own message that says time to
But the intermediary can't do that. The intermediary going away needs to tell both sides, or one side's like, this is going away. And then you might receive that and be like, okay, I need to do that. And the intermediary can't insert an application level message. It can only insert a WebTransport level message.
That makes me sad on a number of levels.
I mean, I've been sad about this for years, but we're getting there. I don't know. Coming back to whether this should be wrap up, I don't know. It's also, I mean, I've also thought for several years that there's a lot of overlap between what's going on in Mask and what's going on in WebTransport, and that we could have done more of the same. And at the end of the day, that's not what we did. And this is very small. And if there's two of them that do the same thing, or I'm not going to be that sad.
Gotcha.
Hello, Eric Corbody, Apple. I just thought I'd throw in the opinion that if it was the case that we would be considering any W3C API, that I think it would absolutely make sense to have this state. In the event that, of course, like, we have WebTransport defined over HTTP, but since it's not necessarily constrained to that, if this capability would be useful at the API surface, I imagine that it would probably make sense to have the state be expressed in HTTP as well, kind of just for consistency's sake.
Thank you. Individual David?
What was I going to say? It's a long week. Yeah, so I think, to echo what some folks have said, if we have two capsules that end up meaning similar things, then like it's pretty easy in your code to parse both of them and call the same function. So one option that we also have is if we keep them separate for now, and if the wrap-up capsule magically ends up being what we need in WebTransport and like going through working group last call at an opportune time, then we can change our, like say, oh, good, this is here, we can switch to it. But based on the discussions we had yesterday in HTTP, that capsule could go in all sorts of ways. We could be adding more, like some folks were suggesting that we focus on the use case of rate limiting, and we might want to put stuff in there. So it could go in a direction that wouldn't be the right fit for WebTransport. So I would suggest to keep them separate. Like we have 2 to the 62 capsule types available, and if we run out, then we're really doing something wrong. So anyway, and then now speaking as chair, again, looking through the issues, Eric, what you were saying is that, if I understand you correctly, is that you would want the W3C API to enforce a requirement.
If possible, although Alan makes a very compelling point.
Yeah.
Always.
Yeah. So I was going to say that's a W3C conversation that we can't really have here.
Yeah, the reason I mention that is because the W3C conversation hinged on the intent behind the text in the IETF spec. So the conversation for us to have here is, what did we intend?
or what should we intend, probably.
Well, that is the hope, yes.
Okay.
All right, so we'll take some of this and go around a few more times. If there are changes that are made to wrap up in HTTP because of good feedback, I would hate to have us invent the stupid version here. But if it's that it's solving a fundamentally different use case, then I think that's fine.
Well, I can go tell the author of the wrap-up castle to let us know if they change something.
I was not super worried about the notifications there, but you know, it's late in the week.
I'll take a to-do.
For our last slide, and one of our final issues, we still have some, but we're getting close to done. Let's talk about flow control. We have an open pull request, if we go to the next slide, that brings the flow control capsules that are relevant from H2. You saw the struck through one I removed from this slide to make things a little cleaner. In practice, go click that link, read the pull request. It's a lot of frame definitions. They're just a copy and paste from the H2 draft. It turns out we need 2 frames, and then they obviously have like their friends to say, hey, I'm blocked. But we've spent many, many hours of working group time talking about them. It turns out when you actually write the text and when you actually write the implementation, what you're really talking about is handling those two things. So just 2 little frames with an asterisk on the end. So this is a call to say, hey, this topic that we've gone around on a couple of times has an open pull request. I imagine that we might consensus call it or otherwise give some time for people to go review it. But please do click the link in the slides or just go to GitHub. It's one of the only open pull requests. And leave some comments, leave some feedback. Turns out it's not that painful.
Yep. So again, to insist, please do review it. We'll have to decide if, depending on, because there's already been some feedback. If we get enough on the pull request, we might decide that that's enough, and then we can merge it and move on. So if you care, make sure in the next week or so to review it, or to at least say on there, hey, I'm going to review it, and then we'll be pestering you. Thank you.
Came out reasonably cleanly, so nothing too painful. All right, next slide.
Oh, well, look at that. 3 minutes after, we're great time management over here. Thank you very much, Victor, and thank you for making the slides, and thank you very much, Eric, for doing a solid Victor impersonation. All right, I think we did good, made some progress on quite a few issues. I think we're getting pretty close. The main aspect we need right now is PRs to be written and PRs to be reviewed so that we can cut these implementations drafts. What I mentioned for HTTP2 earlier applies equally to HTTP3. And so I would love to see us get into a place where we have those ready before Dublin so that we can have our for like an interop matrix at the hackathon. Yeah, I think with that, thanks everyone for coming. Bernard, any last words?
Nope. I think we've got a pretty clear path forward.
All right. Thanks, everyone, and see you on GitHub and the mailing list, and otherwise in Dublin.